Cartoonist and film producer Walt Disney once said, "We keep moving forward, opening new doors and doing new things because we're curious, and curiosity keeps leading us down new paths."
Welcome to the A&P Professor, a few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with a veteran educator and teaching mentor, your host, Kevin Patton.
This episode is a review of the past year of this podcast. As I just mentioned in the intro, and also talked about in the preview episode that preceded this full episode, what I'm going to be doing is debriefing what went on in our podcast over the last year. And I did something similar last year at the end of the first full year of the A&P Professor podcast, and I called that episode A Big Year. And so this episode I'm calling Another Big Year. I should have called it An Even Bigger Year because I was actually kind of surprised as I went through my process of debriefing and looked at what went on. Holy smoke, we covered a lot of stuff. And I'll be getting to that in a minute. But before I do, I just want to remind you that debriefing is something that I've mentioned a lot, and that's because I really believe in it. I think that at regular intervals throughout the academic year, and maybe even separate debriefings, at the end of multiple years, like every 5 years or something like that, we should step back and really take some time and effort and really mindfully debrief and dissect and review and reflect on what we've been doing, because I think this can be really affirming. I mean, it is for me that I can go back especially in a year or a semester or even half a semester, when I'm thinking that all I've been doing is putting one foot in front of the other and not really accomplishing anything much. Not anything useful. I often find that when I go back and actually tally it up and look at it and think about it, I'm really happy about the fact that there were some things in there, that I really did accomplish some things. And so that's one of the main reasons why I like debriefing, is because it makes me feel good. But it also gives me some great ideas on things that I can leverage and maybe do better next time, or extend and do more of, or gives me an idea to do something completely different. And so I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the advantages of debriefing. It's a good reminder for ourselves of what worked well and what didn't work well over the past period of time. It's also a good time to bring our CV up to date, or our resume, or our publication list, or however it is that we're recording our life's work. And we can do anything related to that, such as at some schools, you need to submit a timeline of things that you've done, committees you've been on, projects you've done, how often you did pet sitting for your dean's pets. And that goes into your promotion package, or it goes into your evaluation file or something like that. So you can really make that debriefing time, you can roll a bunch of different tasks into it and make it a really useful thing in many different ways. And it's also a form of spaced retrieval practice, because it gives us an opportunity to identify and reinforce core concepts, because we're going over them again and recalling them again and pulling them back out of our brains. So as I go through this episode and I mention past topics, things are going to get pulled out of your brain. You're going to go in there and start pulling things out again, and that's going to help keep them in your long-term memory. When we do this in our courses, we could ask students to do that. Students always want in-class reviews, right? For them, I think they see that sometimes as a substitute for actually studying. Let's review the test. Meaning, I don't want to spend my own time reviewing for the test. I want you to review for me. But it might not be a bad idea if you have class time to do that. Yeah, they're looking for specific hints on exactly what's going to be on the test. They'd probably prefer it if you just gave them a list of the correct answers or something. But what you can do is just spark them a little bit and get them thinking about all of the different things that they have been learning all along, and that will help them with their retrieval practice. There are other ways to do it too. The way I usually do it is not in class, but in the form of online practice exams right before the midterm exam and final exam. So that gives them a way to do their debriefing and relearning of stuff, because it's kind of showing them where in their study materials and in their textbook they need to dive back in and refresh themselves. So let's do it. Let's do some debriefing. A searchable transcript and a captioned audiogram of this episode are funded by AAA, the American Association for Anatomy. You can find them at anatomy.org. And don't forget that if you're already a member of HAPS, you can join AAA for a greatly reduced rate. Check it out. Just go to anatomy.org and click the membership tab. I don't know, maybe it's the scientist in me, but when I do debriefing, one of the first steps I take is to count things up because, I don't know, I just feel more comfortable starting with numbers, with data in the form of numbers, and work from there. And that's what I did with the podcast over the last year. And I came up with some numbers that kind of surprised me, so I'm glad I did it this way. The first somewhat surprising number, I guess I should have known it if I'd been keeping track of this, is the number 1,453. That's how many minutes of listening we had this year. So you add that up, that's 24 hours and 13 minutes. I didn't realize I could talk. Yeah, okay, we all realize I can talk that much. And that's over the course of a year. So yeah, that's doable, and I sure did it, didn't I? Another lucky number is number 25, which if you listen to the preview episode, you know is the number of book club recommendations that I had this year in the A&P Professor book club. And in the preview, I listed all 25 of them. I didn't stop and talk about each one, but I did list them all to kind of remind us and maybe shake loose our memory so we know what's still sitting in our Kindle waiting for us to read or on our Audible library shelf. And our next lucky number is 5. There were 5 contributors to the A&P Professor book club, and each one of them got a $25 Amazon gift card. And that promotion is ongoing. So if you want to get a $25 Amazon gift card and you have a book that you think will be helpful to other A&P teachers, and it doesn't necessarily need to be directly related to anatomy and physiology content. It could be, but there have been a variety. If you listen to the preview, you heard there's a whole variety of kinds of books that in some way help us as A&P teachers. And the 5 contributors we had this year, I thank them very much. They are Mindy Freed, Margaret Reese, Elizabeth Grenier, Kim Terry, and Marty Port. And by the way, Marty also won the drawing for a Kindle Fire HD10 tablet. So that drawing promotion is over, but maybe we'll have another kind of promotion coming up this year. Then the next lucky number is number 26. So write these down, because if you're going to go out and buy a lottery ticket, you might need some lucky numbers. Lucky number 26 is for the 26 regular episodes, that is full episodes that we had this year. We had 22 preview episodes, and that's a lower number than the regular episodes because a few of those episodes did not require a preview because there was something special about them. We also, in the previews, dissected 107 terms because we have that segment called Word Dissection. And in the preview to this episode, I listed all 107. As a matter of fact, I upped it to 108 because I added the word dissect, and we dissected that term. So it's a mix of commonly used terms in A&P and also new terms that are going to be coming up in the segments because, as you know, I have some science content updates, and sometimes the terminology is not familiar to us as A&P teachers, or there is new terminology, some new discovery that requires a new term, and we dissect that and look at that. So 107, well, really 108 terms we dissected this year. So good opportunity to go back and refresh those. Lucky number 1 for 1 extra bonus episode. So that occurred in October when they announced the Nobel Prize in the category of physiology or medicine. So we had a whole episode on what that was about and how that relates to us teaching A&P. Lucky number 3, that's for 3 special episodes. That's what I called some longer single topic episodes that had classic segments in them. That is segments that had appeared on previous podcasts over the course of the past year or longer. And they were things that were related to one another. So I pulled them together so that they were all together on a single topic. So there were 3 of those this year. And let me know whether you enjoyed those or not. I think you probably did because I had a lot of downloads of them. But give me some feedback on those. Would you like to see me go back and pull together some other topics and put them all in one place and give us a chance to refresh ourselves on that? Let me know. Call the podcast hotline. Let me know. Next lucky number is number 94. We had 94 different segments over the course of the last year. 34 of those were science updates. 41 of them were teaching strategies. 19 of them were special segments where they were, announcements about different things that didn't fit really in the category of a science update or a teaching strategy. And there were actually more segments than those 94, but I didn't count some of them. Some of them, like in the special episodes where the segments were repeated from previous episodes, I didn't count those. Sometimes in a featured topic, I'll break it up a little bit just so it's not one long rant from Kevin. And so I'll put like a little break in between. So I didn't count those as separate segments usually either. And then, of course, I didn't count the sponsor mentions, even though technically those are segments, and announcements I didn't count. So really, there were way more than 94 segments, but 94 sort of featured segments, if you want to call them that. Next lucky number is lucky number 2. That is the number of new sponsors that started with us this year. So we already had in the first year, at different points, we added AAA, American Association for Anatomy, which had a big thing happen this year. They changed their name from the American Association of Anatomists to American Association for Anatomy. So they were an existing sponsor, and HAPS also was an existing sponsor, Human Anatomy Physiology Society. But this year we added 2 more. First, in episode 38, we introduced our new sponsor, the HAPI program. That's HAPI. That's the Human Anatomy and Physiology Instruction Program from NYCC. Most recently, that is in January 2020, we added a month-long sponsorship from AD Instruments. And you may recall that they've been running a promotion that actually goes all the way through March, even though they advertised it only during January. That is, you get 10% off of select solutions if you go to their website at go.adinstruments.com/podcast and use their solution builder and then mention this podcast in any web form. And that goes through the end of March. Now, AD Instruments may come back as a sponsor later for another promotion. And I suspect if you go to go.adinstruments.com/podcast and actually take advantage of this 10% off, then maybe they'll be more likely to come back. So thank you to all of our sponsors because they help defray some of the expenses and helps keep this podcast going. Another lucky number is lucky number 10. That is the number of extra bonus content that was made available in the free TAP app, in addition to what had been there from the previous year. So let me go through the 10 things just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that I add to the TAP app that you can't really get when you're listening from the webpage or listening from Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or Spotify or Pandora or Stitcher or Pocket Cast or Castro or any of the other ones. And those are all great programs, and I go on listening to them, but you might also want to get the free TAP app, and all you need to do, it's only available on mobile devices, and you go to your mobile device store, your app store, and just type in the A&P Professor. Don't forget that initial the. I found out just a couple of weeks ago somebody was trying to do that, and if you just put A&P Professor, it's not going to show up. You have to put the A&P Professor, and then you just download it for free and put it in your device. So what are they? What are the bonus content items that are in there? One is a little video showing you how to make flashcards float in the air. So that one was a silly one. But the rest of them were much more to the point in terms of actual teaching and learning. One was a list of syllabus warnings that I include in my syllabus, and we talked about on one of the episodes. So that gives you a copy of what I have. So you can use that as sort of a launching point for perhaps including your own warnings in your syllabus. And along similar lines, I also had a page, a handout type thing that have my safety information. It's called Safety First. So that gives you the kind of safety addendum that I give in my syllabus. I have another resource there that's called Terms That Are Often Misspelled or Confused in A&P. And I think that's a good one to revisit every once in a while. Just print it out or save it on your disk or something somewhere and go through it every once in a while. And that is useful for students because they can go through it and see where they're likely to make mistakes. But it's also good for us because we make mistakes too. But it's also good in helping counsel students. And then another resource was regional spelling differences. So I was going to say it spells out, but maybe that's not a good way to say it. It walks you through how spelling is different between U.S. spelling and non-U.S. spelling. So it gives you some of the patterns and then gives you examples of each of those within anatomy and physiology so that you're aware of some of these different spellings. So those are the regional spelling differences. And then the next resource was published or put out there before that one. I'm going in kind of reverse order here, is a handout on the fishbowl model of homeostasis, which I talked about in one of the episodes. So it kind of spells it all out. And you can use that handout with your students or just use it as a kind of a starting point if you want to tell the fishbowl story or story similar to it. I also had a video, which was a seminar that I did at one of the HAPS meetings on running concept lists. So you can go look at that. And then I had a little video showing you a sorting folder that I use when I'm doing tests and exams in class. And this is especially useful for a large class, but even a smaller, moderate-sized class. What it does is it kind of automatically alphabetizes student papers as they turn them in a very simple, straightforward way. And the video shows you how it works. And then I have a diagram that you can use in your course if you want that shows the location of the fibula, which is a bone that more and more of us are showing up. They're showing up in our knees. It's increasing its frequency in the population. It was considered to be a relatively rare anomaly, and now it's becoming more common. That was discussed in one of the episodes. And then we have another table that you can use as a handout for your students or just for your own use. And it's a muscle name table where it translates each of the major muscle names. It translates them literally, and we can use that as a mnemonic device to help us remember characteristics of that muscle. So, lots of stuff this year, and that's not the end of it. I'm going to actually dive into some of those groupings that I just talked about in later segments of this episode. The free distribution of this podcast is sponsored by the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology instruction, the HAPI degree. I'm on the faculty of this program, and you may have heard we're looking for another online adjunct professor with extensive experience in teaching undergrad A&P to join our tight-knit, fun-loving, hard-working faculty. Check out the job posting for this position or details about the online graduate program at nycc.edu/HAPI, that's HAPI, or click the link in the show notes or episode page. To find the job post, just scroll to the bottom of the landing page and click Employment Opportunities. And it's already been posted in the free TAP app too. Whether you're looking to join us as a learner or as faculty, be sure to mention that you heard about it here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there were 34 science update segments over the last year in this podcast. Now, that's not anywhere close to the number of actual discoveries this year that are relevant to the A&P course. But I look at this kind of like I do the A&P course itself. You cannot possibly discuss everything or have students try to learn everything, so you pick and choose a manageable set of concepts that will tell the story well. That is, in a way that will help students get a deeper understanding of the core ideas they need when they walk away from the course. And just as every A&P teacher makes choices that differ, at least in part, from other A&P teachers, I probably made some different choices than you would have made in my shoes. And that's okay. I'm just hopeful that the choices I've made have been helpful to you in some small way. I do want to emphasize that I don't give these science updates as recommendations of what you now need to add to your A&P course. First, they're often new reports, which means that they need more testing and more discussion among scientists before they're considered ready for inclusion in a course. Second, they're often at a level of understanding that is far more detailed than most, perhaps all, of us should be discussing with our students. Which leads me to the main reason that I give these science updates. That is to sort of extend that deep training we got way back when we were students and then moved up through graduate level courses and kept on adding to our knowledge and understanding since graduation. I'm just sort of sharing what I've run across that you might want to add to that background knowledge that informs your teaching of A&P without it actually becoming part of your course. Okay, all that being said, there are some of these science updates that will and should make it into your course. I just wanted to make the point that we shouldn't look at them as must-adds, but more as professional updates for our own use and for making our own choices about what goes into our course. So, what are the science updates that came up over the last year? Well, we revisited that recurring question of whether adult brains produce new neurons, which has sort of morphed into more of a question of where adult brain neurogenesis happens and how much and what regulates it. And for me, a question that is all important regarding adult brain neurogenesis is, how can I increase the rate of forming new neurons? Really, I need that. It came up several times during the first season, and again this season in episodes 37 and 41. Now here are some other topics that came up, and I am going to run through them pretty quick, but it's meant just to kind of stimulate our recollection and to kind of remind you that we covered these things, and you might want to go back and review them again if you've already heard them, or it might be a good stimulus to go back and to listen to episodes that you haven't heard before, because it has this content in it. So in episode 37, we talked about adult neurogenesis, as I just mentioned, yet again, and we discussed this idea that came out a while back about whether sacral neural outflow, is it sympathetic or is it parasympathetic? And we know what the classic model is, but I don't know, some people have been challenging that. That was also in episode 37. There was also a segment on reserve hematopoiesis. And then in episode 38, we had several updates. One was, what happens when you swallow a Lego? How long does it take to get from point A to point B? That is, how long does it take to get from mouth to anus? In case you were wondering, and we know that questions like that do come up in our class, right? So you want to check that out to get the answer. We also talked about how the gut makes 10% of our blood. So we're talking about hematopoiesis. Well, yeah, the gut makes 10% of it. Do you teach that in your class? Do you even mention the gut as a source or a site of hematopoiesis? We also, in episode 38, talked about the speed of sperm and why they must be fast. In episode 39, we talked about the evolving understanding of the cerebellum's functions. And also in episode 39, we talked about how scientists have discovered how the liver anticipates food that is going to be ingested. And then episode 39 also talked about how we really, in science, just don't know much about how exercise, diet, metabolism, body weight, how all that fits together and how it works as a system. It's still far from being worked out. And that's an important concept when we teach A&P. In episode 41, we did yet another one of those updates in adult brain neurogenesis. And in episode 43, we talked a lot about anatomic variations. So the whole episode was about anatomic variations. In episode 44, we talked about something called semi-identical twinning, which I had never heard of before, but now I know what it is. In episode 46, we did an update on bone growths. There's some new information about how bone grows. And also in episode 46, I talked about the idea of measles, which unfortunately is part of our disease outlook in modern times. Again, it sort of went away, at least in most areas of the world, and now it's coming back in many areas of the world. And we see that it causes, or at least can cause, immune amnesia. So when you get measles, measles itself can be very serious. It can be mild, but it can be very serious. But not only that, it's going to mess with your immune system so that for several years, you're more prone to getting other kinds of infections. Ouch. In episode 51, we again revisited the idea of making new neurons in the adult brain. And we also talked about how the senses of smell and taste overlap. And we did a segment understanding how mouse brains and human brains, are they really that useful for understanding neuroscience when we use animal models, or are they? So those questions were explored in episode 51. In the following episode, episode 52, we talked about some issues regarding mapping out the brain. And we also talked about some things we've discovered about the possibility of reversing biological age and what that even means. And also we talked about the genes for left-handedness and what kinds of factors go into making us left-handed or right-handed. And then in episode 53, we talked about the role of exosomes in the metastasis of cancer, and that was a new discovery. And also in that episode, we talked about how the kinds of activity you do in terms of the kind of exercise, assuming you do some kind of activity, how that affects the overall shape of your heart. And we also, in episode 54, talked about vaping, not only the sudden awareness of some of these vaping-related illnesses, but how we might incorporate that in our A&P course as a sort of practical application of some important principles about human anatomy and physiology, and, as a basis for case studies and things like that. We also talked about how it matters what time of the day you get your vaccination, that vaccinations are not equally effective given at any time of the day. There are certain times of the day where they're most effective. And we also talked about neurons that cause forgetting, and forgetting is important. We need to forget some stuff so we can make room for the stuff we want to remember. So that was all in episode 54. And then there was a bonus episode 54 that I labeled episode 54A, and that was the one on the 2019 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. And that was all about how cells sense and adapt to oxygen availability. And we put that in the context of what we are learning about cells and oxygen availability in the A&P course. And then in episode 56, we talked about a newly discovered form of RNA called glycoRNA. You may have heard about sugary RNA or some other variation of that, but it's usually called glycoRNA. So we talked about what is it and why should we know about it? And also in episode 56, we talked about how macrophages form a barrier. They form a membrane in synovial joints. And there was even a little diagram in the show notes and episode page. And then in episode 58, we talked about how gene therapy can grow new adult brain cells. And in that episode, we talked about how some people can smell even when MRIs show that they don't have an olfactory bulb. So how can you smell without having an olfactory bulb? Well, listen to episode 58 and you'll find out. In episode 59, we talked about the term pseudogene, and we talked about how at least some scientists are saying that that's a misleading term. And they didn't really offer a substitute, but they talked about the fact that it can be dangerously misleading. And so I'm thinking maybe we want to keep that in mind if the term pseudogene comes up in our course. And I also did an analogy that I use with my own students about the role of junk DNA or pseudogenes in the human genome. In episode 59, I talked about the discovery that podcasts may be safe and effective sleep aids. As a matter of fact, you might be sound asleep right now and you don't even know that I'm telling you about this because they're so effective at sleep aids. So I talked about why that is so, and that helps us understand the process of sleep. And then episode 61, which was the episode right before this one, we talked about transplant effects in the human genome and how when you get transplanted stem cells, as you would in a bone marrow transplant, that can actually alter your genome, at least in certain ways, and looked at a particular famous case of that. And then in the same episode, we also talked about the biological hazards of Wi-Fi. So wow, that is a lot of different stuff, and there's a lot of stuff I could have covered and just didn't have time to cover, but that's okay. I'm keeping a list, and I don't know that I'm going to get to all of it, but I am certain I won't run out. And you know that somebody's discovering something right at this very moment that you're listening to this that will probably end up in an episode sometime this coming year. Marketing support for this podcast is provided by HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, promoting excellence in the teaching of human anatomy and physiology for over 30 years. Have you seen the latest issue of the HAPS Educator? As always, there's a great variety of interesting content, including some great teaching tips. Go visit HAPS at theapprofessor.org/HAPS. That's HAPS. If you're a regular listener, you know that the other big thing, the somewhat bigger thing that I do in this podcast, is share strategies and insights on the art and science of teaching anatomy and physiology. Or maybe I should say, the art and science and magic of teaching anatomy and physiology. Now's probably a good time to remind you that what I share is based partly on my own experience teaching anatomy and physiology for several decades, and partly on what I've seen and heard from colleagues over the years, and what I'm seeing in the literature of teaching and learning in anatomy and physiology, or just teaching and learning in general. Often I get insights from you, dear listener, so be sure to keep those coming. Sometime in the next decade, I will probably run out of ideas and experiences to share, and possibly run out of stories to tell. No, that could never happen. I'll never run out of stories to tell, because I always forget which stories I've told, so I can always tell them over again thinking that they're new to you. Anyway, I don't want to test those limits because it's more fun and more helpful if we get a mix of ideas, even if it's a challenge to something I've said. So please call in. Looking back over the last year at these 40-something plus segments on ideas, tips, and stories about teaching, what kinds of things come up? Well, first of all, during the summer, I brought back some ideas from earlier episodes, even from the first year, and grouped them by theme into special one-topic episodes. So what were they? Episode 48 was the storytelling special, where I pulled in classic segments about teaching as a form of storytelling. And then episode 49 was the silent teacher special, where I had classic segments about the humanity of human body donors and even reproductions made from them. And I had some related book recommendations. And we had a couple of different conversations with Aaron Fried, who really focuses on these aspects of his course. And then in episode 50, we brought together classic segments about supporting students in distance and hybrid courses in order to improve student retention and to improve student success. And that was called the Connecting in the Distance Course Special. So those were the special episodes. But doing a quick survey here, and I know this can get a little old when I just start listing things, but I'm doing it for the purpose, sort of a roll call type thing, to kind of stimulate our brains a little bit and recall for us the kinds of things that were going on, and maybe, give you some hints as to what you want to go back and listen to again, or maybe for the first time. So in episode 37, I talked about this idea of there being a last best story in any of the concepts that we are talking about or exploring in our A&P course. And so I'll say to students, okay, we're going to talk about how the kidney works. But what I'm going to tell you today is the last best story. And what that means is that next year that story may have changed. But this is the best story we have so far. It's the last best story. I also talked about how emphasizing that not only helps them adapt to the changing landscape of the human body where, they're going to get into a different course and find out that things have changed. And like, well, which one's right? Well, if they've already been primed to know that things, how we understand things, how accurately we understand things changes over time, then that helps prepare them cognitively for that. Also, it really kind of underscores how science works, that we're always trying to get better, right? So last best story. Also in episode 37, we brought back a previous topic of giving feedback on online tests and how best to do that. And then we talked about the anatomical compass and the anatomical rosette. And so that's like on a map where you see that little rosette in the corner that has north, south, east, west. Well, here we have anterior, posterior, superior, inferior. And we can use that sort of like a little training device to get our students used to orienting themselves in the various diagrams and photographs and so on that they're using in the course. Hopefully by the time they're done with A&P, they can stop using it, but it's a good thing that we can either use in the resources that we're creating for them, or we can have students do it as sort of a practice on their own when they're making sketches from their dissections or their explorations of models and different things, and they can draw in those little anatomic rosettes, and that helps them really reinforce those anatomical directions. In episode 38, we talked about surveying our students and doing debriefing in the middle of the course. Not just at the end of the course, but in the middle of the course, because if we wait till the end of the course, then it's too late. And in episode 39, we talked about the literal meaning of muscle names and how that can be a mnemonic aid for students. And that is one of the most downloaded episodes of all of last year. And so if you haven't listened to it, you might want to go back and listen to it because I think that's a pretty popular one. And then in episode 40, we talked about what is an eponym, what do we do with eponyms in modern usage, what are some problems with eponyms. We talked about, some different strategies that we can use to deal with eponyms in our course. And there are lots of choices there. And I talked about the kinds of choices I make and why I make them, but that's just to get us thinking about why that might be. And then we talked about eponyms again in the following episode 41, when listener Mike Pasco called in and had something to say about that. And so we kept that conversation going. And I will tell you that is going to come up again in this upcoming season because I've had some feedback on it that I think warrants us to dive deeper into some other aspects of using eponyms and looking at some additional ways of looking at eponyms. And also in episode 41, we talked about some ways to find media that we can use in our teaching, things like videos and images and so on that we can use in teaching A&P. We also talked about what we call our students, being careful about addressing them appropriately, that is using their names, for example, pronouncing their names correctly. And then episode 43, we talked about the fibula bone in the knee, and that was part of a whole episode on anatomic variation where we also had a segment on situs inversus, and we had a segment on levocardia. And then in episode 44, we talked about an easy way to sort student papers for grading and recording, and I mentioned that earlier because there's also a bonus video that goes along with that. And in episode 44, we also talked about using stickers as far as feedback on tests and so on, and how that's sort of gamifying or adding a level of gamification to our course that might help motivate students a little bit, surprisingly so, actually. And then episode 44, we also talked about how students address faculty. Do you want to be addressed as Dr. whomever, or Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. whomever? Or do you want to be addressed by your first name or just your last name or what? And so we discussed that in episode 44. In episode 45, I gave you one of the models that I use in discussing homeostasis called the fishbowl model. And we also talked about a poll that I took about how different professors like to be addressed. And so that was a follow-up from the previous episode. And in episode 45, I also mentioned that I have that concept list seminar available as a video in the free TAP app. And I've already talked about that in this review episode. And then in episode 46, I talked about another model of homeostasis that I use, which I call the Wallenda model, but it's the model of a high wire artist walking across a wire and how that can illustrate some important principles of homeostasis for us. And then moving on to episode 47, I talked about how teachers, human teachers, are going to be important even in the age of artificial intelligence, which is already starting in education. And we might worry that, oh my gosh, robots are going to take over, that computers are going to take over, and they're going to be the teachers, and we won't have human teachers anymore. And I talked about how that will probably never be true. And what is it that we can do, and what skills do we have that we can reinforce so that we're ready for this age of artificial intelligence, and that we can leverage our humanness to make us valuable to students as a teacher. And we also talked in episode 47 about teaching the human microbiome, which I usually call the human microbial system. And then episode 51, we talked about transparency in our courses and why we should let students know why we do the things we do and why we have the course policies we have, rather than it just being dictated to them with no explanation. And then in episode 52, we talked about the use of case studies in teaching A&P, some different aspects of that. Also in the same episode, I gave some tips for answering frustrating student questions. And then in episode 53, I talked about some very powerful ways that we can amplify learning in our courses. In episode 54, I talked about the release of an updated set of A&P learning outcomes from the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society and kind of highlighted what some of the changes are in that document. And then in episode 55, I asked the question, is spelling important? And I answered that question by saying, yes it is. And why, I explained why I believe spelling is important. And I talked about alternate spellings, and I even talked about using proper case, that is, capitalization is important in professional communication. And that kind of led to a discussion of professionalism as a course objective. You know, my students often say, well, this isn't a spelling course, this isn't an English course. You know, why are you demanding that I use proper spelling? This is an anatomy course. And my position is, well, professional communication is part of anatomy and physiology. And yes, that is an objective in our course. And maybe it's about time that we listed that in our course objectives or something like it. And then in episode 56, I clarified why I have such a hard line on misspelling and also clarified that I do it as part of a formative testing regimen. So it's not something that they just get hit with once and they fail or they don't. They get hit with it multiple times in a formative process so that they eventually learn correct spelling. And then also in episode 56, we talked about some ways that we can put labels on models that we use in our lab practicals without damaging those models. Because let's face it, over time, even a little bit of damage can add up and cause significant damage to pieces of equipment that are very, very expensive, as you well know. And then in episode 57, we talked about different things I put into my syllabus. I put in some warnings, I put in some safety tips. And so you can go back to episode 57 and see what I mean by that and see if it sparks some ideas for maybe tweaking the kinds of things that you have in your own syllabus. Or maybe you might decide, this is just the silliest thing in the world, I'm not going to do anything like it. But that's okay, you'll learn something from it. And then in episode 58, well, actually 58, 59, and 60, it was a whole series on flashcards. And not just the basics, there's lots of things that a lot of us don't think about that we can leverage flashcards in ways that really bring us down to very deep levels of learning. So episodes 58, 59, and 60. And then episode 61, the last episode of the second year of the A&P Professor podcast, was involving issues and questions surrounding required prerequisites for the A&P course. And I've been getting a lot of interesting and positive feedback from listeners about that. So if you haven't heard that episode yet, you might want to go back soon and listen to it. So we had lots of different topics about teaching, right? A lot of different applications in teaching anatomy and physiology. And if you have some questions, some ideas and so on for future topics and future episodes, or questions about what I was talking about in previous episodes, or you want to challenge something and say, no, here's a better way to do it, or here's some problems with the way you're recommending that we do it, please, please, please let me know about that, and we'll make that part of the conversation here on the podcast. It's a good time for reflection. So I'm asking you for about 5 minutes of your time to fill out a survey. It's put together by a team of podcast analysts at PodTrack to see who is listening and to help figure out what's working and what's not. I'm asking you now to please take just a few minutes of your time to respond to the anonymous survey, because it's your experience as an individual listener that's important to me. Just go to the approfessor.org/survey. Thanks for your support. Okay, no more lists of things, I promise. Not in this episode, at least. No more lists. But I do want to talk a little bit about the future. And part of the future is what I just recently mentioned, and that is you. I really would love to see more feedback. And thank you for the feedback I've gotten so far. But I'd love to see some more feedback. Call in or write in with your questions or with suggestions. Or if any of you want to do a segment on your own, or maybe we can do a conversation, interview-style conversation where we talk to one another. Bring that up. Maybe you have an article that you have written that you want to talk about the ideas in that article, or a book that you've written. You want to talk about the ideas in that book, any of that stuff. So I'm inviting you to really be even more of a participant than you've been in this podcast going forward. Along those lines, someone whose name has come up already in this episode before, but several times throughout the past couple of years, and that is our friend Krista Rumpolsky. Some of you may know her from HAPS or from her activity within the American Association for Anatomy and the different writing projects that she's involved in. But Krista's been a longtime listener, has given us a lot of feedback and insights in the podcast, and we're going to make that a regular part of the podcast this year. Starting in late spring and on a regular basis, what Krista is going to do is come in with some ideas that she's gotten from her ongoing review of the literature of teaching and learning, especially as it applies to human anatomy and physiology. So that's going to become a regular segment going forward. And there are a few guests that I've been talking with about coming on for interviews, some whose name you've heard here before, others that aren't even in the A&P world, but have some things to offer us. And so I'm looking forward to having them on as well. So I have some ideas for things to do in the future, but as always, I'm very willing to listen to your ideas about ways that we can make this podcast better and more useful for you going forward. Hey, don't forget that I always put links in the show notes and at the episode page at the approfessor.org in case you want to further explore any of the ideas mentioned in this podcast, or if you want to visit our sponsors. And you're always encouraged to call in with your questions, comments, and ideas at the podcast hotline. That's 1-833-LION-DEN or 1-833-546-6336. Or send a recording, a written message to podcast@theapprofessor.org. I'll see you down the road.
The A&P Professor is hosted by Dr. Kevin Patton, an award-winning professor and textbook author in human anatomy and physiology.
The content of this episode is 97% recycled waste and is therefore unsafe for drinking. Support for this episode comes from the American Association for Anatomy, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, and the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology Instruction.